Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging into a phrase that's, well, it's pretty much impossible to ignore. Cancel culture.
It really is everywhere.
It is, isn't it? You see it in headlines. It pops up in just casual conversations, definitely dominates social media feeds. And it just ignites these really passionate debates on news channels.
Yeah, and for some people, it's seen as this vital tool for accountability. A way to right wrongs and challenge power structures.
But then for others, it's this chilling new form of censorship, something that stifles free expression, maybe even ruins lives.
Exactly. It's not just a buzzword. It's a concept that gets these immediate, sometimes really visceral reactions.
And it's deeply impacting our society and the individuals who get caught up in it all.
What's truly fascinating here, I think, is how profoundly divided opinions are. I mean, even on the basic definition of the term itself.
Right.
Our sources, they really paint this landscape where, what one person views as just essential accountability, someone else sees as totally unjust punishment, or even, like you said, a direct assault on free speech.
It's like a semantic battleground.
It really is. The meaning of the term itself becomes a proxy for these bigger ideological clashes.
Absolutely. So our mission today is to try and unspool these incredibly complex threads. We've meticulously pulled together a pretty diverse range of sources for this deep dive.
Yeah, we've got quite a mix.
We do. We're going to be exploring a major survey from the Pew Research Center that gives us a broad statistical view of American perspectives. We also have this deeply insightful qualitative study from the Philippines.
Which gives those really personal accounts the human dimension.
Exactly, the stories behind the numbers. Then there are these rigorous ethical analyses from university experts which kind of help us frame the core debates with academic clarity. And finally, we've even drawn from a nuanced, sometimes fiery online political forum to capture that raw, real-time pulse of public opinion.
Yeah, get a sense of the ground-level conversation.
Our goal here is really just to extract the most important nuggets of knowledge, maybe some surprising facts, just help you become truly well-informed about this incredibly divisive topic. We're not taking sides, just trying to illuminate all the different perspectives and their far-reaching implications. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Before we even get into what it means, how familiar are people with the actual term cancel culture?
That's a great starting point. The Pew Research Center looked at this back in September 2020.
Right.
And they found about 44% of Americans had heard at least a fair amount about the phrase.
Okay, so less than half, but still significant.
Right. And here's a striking detail. Almost half of that group. So 22% of all Americans said they'd heard a great deal about it.
Wow. So a smaller group feels very familiar with it.
Exactly. But what's maybe equally telling and perhaps a bit surprising given how pervasive it feels in certain circles.
It feels like it everywhere sometimes.
Is that a larger share, 56%, had actually heard little to nothing about it. And 38% specifically said they had heard nothing at all.
That really suggests that while cancel culture might dominate certain conversations, maybe online or in the media, it's far from universally recognized across the board.
It's true. This early data from Pew highlights that even basic awareness isn't uniform. And the nuances and familiarity are, they're quite revealing.
Like what? What do they find there?
Well, for instance, age plays a really significant role in who's heard of it. A substantial 64% of adults under 30 said they were familiar with the term.
64%. Okay.
Compare that sharply with just 34% of those aged 50 and older.
Wow, that's a big gap, almost double.
It points to a pretty clear generational divide, doesn't it? Perhaps reflecting different levels of engagement with, online spaces where the term often originates and circulates.
Yeah, that makes sense. Younger people might just encounter it more in their daily digital lives.
Exactly. It might be part of their everyday lexicon in a way it just isn't for older generations.
And it goes beyond just age, right? The data showed other differences too.
It did. Men were more likely than women to be familiar with it. And also those with higher education, a bachelor's or advanced degree, were more familiar than those with less formal education.
Okay. Now, what I found particularly interesting, considering how politically charged these discussions always seem to be, is that the survey found a surprisingly similar level of overall familiarity between Democrats and Republicans.
Yeah.
It was something like 46% versus 44%.
Yeah, you'd almost expect a much bigger gap, given the rhetoric.
Totally. But here's the crucial nuance, right? When you factor in ideology within those parties,
Oh, okay.
liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans were more likely to be familiar with it than their more moderate counterparts.
Yeah.
Liberal Democrats, in fact, actually stood out as the most familiar group overall.
That's a really key observation. This heightened familiarity among the more ideological ends of both parties, liberal Democrats and conservative Republicans, it indicates that while the term is debated across the political spectrum, it resonates most strongly with those more ideologically engaged segments.
So for them, it's maybe more than just a term.
It seems like it. For these groups, cancel culture often functions as this kind of potent shorthand, a shorthand for a set of grievances or maybe aspirations that align with their core beliefs.
Right. So for liberal Democrats, maybe it signifies a push for social justice, accountability.
Potentially. And for conservative Republicans, it could represent an overreach of progressive values, maybe an attack on traditional norms or free speech.
It's almost like it becomes this ready-made narrative for them.
Exactly. A way to explain the social and political shifts they're seeing or experiencing filtered through their particular lens.
Okay, so when people do know the term, how do they actually define it? What does cancel culture mean to them in their own words?
This is where it gets really interesting. The Pew survey allowed people to respond in their own words, open-ended. And the most common theme, by a significant margin, revolved around accountability.
Accountability, okay.
Nearly half, 49% of those familiar with the term, described it as actions taken to hold people accountable.
Which, on the surface, that sounds pretty reasonable, doesn't it? Like a collective effort to make sure people face consequences for what they say or do.
It does sound reasonable, but this immediately raises a really fascinating question. How can we even begin to have a productive societal conversation about something when its very meaning is so profoundly contested?
Because accountability can mean different things to different people, too.
Precisely. And what's particularly telling is that even within that dominant accountability definition, a small but significant portion of those respondents acknowledge that these actions could sometimes be misplaced or ineffective or even cruel.
So even people who see it as accountability recognize it's not always straightforward.
Exactly. It suggests that even those who frame it positively understand there's this complex spectrum of outcomes. It hints at the inherent moral ambiguities. It's definitely not a clear-cut concept, even for its perceived proponents.
That's a really crucial nuance that often gets lost in the shouting matches online.
Definitely.
Beyond accountability, what else came up?
Well, a notable chunk, 14% of people, perceived cancel culture primarily as a form of censorship. They described it as a restriction on free speech or even the erasure of history.
Okay, censorship, that's a very different framing.
Completely different. And a similar share, 12%, characterized it more as just mean-spirited attacks, actions designed purely to cause harm to others, regardless of justification.
So accountability, censorship, or just plain meanness. Those are pretty distinct interpretations.
Indeed. The data clearly reveals this fundamental disagreement on whether the phenomenon is primarily about achieving justice or if it's more about suppression and harm.
Were there other interpretations too?
Yes, though less common. Things like canceling anyone they disagree with, or simply consequences for those challenged, or seeing it as an attack on traditional American values.
And did political leaning play a role here too in how people defined it?
Oh, absolutely. What's particularly striking is how deeply one's political leaning influences these definitions. For example, conservative Republicans who were familiar with the term, they were significantly less likely than any other group to define it as accountability.
Really? How much less likely?
Only 36% of them did so. Compare that to over 50% for moderate or liberal Republicans and for all Democrats.
Wow. So less than 4 in 10 conservative Republicans see it as accountability, compared to more than half of basically everyone else familiar with the term.
Exactly. And conversely,
Let me guess. They were more likely to see it as censorship.
you got it. Conservative Republicans were much more likely to interpret it as censorship. 26% of them did. That's compared to about 15% for other Republicans and roughly 10% or less for Democrats.
Huh.
They also more frequently described it as canceling disagreement or as an attack on traditional American society.
It's absolutely fascinating how our individual political lens just so profoundly shapes our understanding.
Yeah.
You can almost see the ideological battle lines drawn, not just in opinions about cancel culture, but in the very definitions people are using.
That's right.
It's not just disagreeing on policy, it's like disagreeing on the basic nature of what's happening, filtered through this one term.
That insight really deepens our understanding. It shows that the term cancel culture itself has basically become this battleground for different worldviews. The way the phenomenon is framed is often just intrinsically tied to pre-existing political identities and values.
It really highlights how quickly a term can get co-opted, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm. And imbued with vastly different meanings, functioning as this cultural flashprint that reveals all these underlying societal tensions and differing visions for public discourse.
Okay, so moving beyond the abstract definitions, let's think about the actual behaviors involved. The Pew survey also looked at a more general action, calling out others on social media for offensive content.
Right, getting down to the specific action.
Yeah, because that's the concrete action at the heart of so much of this cancel culture discussion, isn't it?
It often is, yes.
So the question is doing that generally about making people answer for their words? Or is it an overreach, maybe punishing people who truly don't deserve it? What do people think overall?
Overall, the majority lean towards accountability. 58% of U.S. adults believed this act, calling people out, generally holds people accountable.
Okay, 58%.
But a significant minority, 38%, saw it primarily as punishing people who don't deserve it.
So still pretty big divide there, roughly 60-40.
A substantial divide. But this is precisely where the public becomes profoundly fractured, especially when you look at it through a political lens.
Here come the partisan splits again.
Oh, yes. It's not just a slight disagreement on specific cases. It's a fundamental difference in how people perceive the intent and the effect of these actions. And that perception is heavily influenced by political affiliation.
How stark is the divide?
It's incredibly stark. A full 75%, three-quarters of Democrats view calling out as accountability.
75%.
Okay. Meanwhile, only 39% of Republicans agree with that.
Wow. Less than 4 in 10 Republicans see it that way.
Exactly. And conversely, a majority of Republicans, 56%, see calling people out as unjust punishment. Compare that to just 22% of Democrats who see it that way.
That is a massive gap. It suggests our shared understanding of what's fair or just in public discourse is just diverging wildly along party lines.
It really does. It speaks to a fundamental philosophical difference, maybe, in how we believe society should regulate speech and behavior, particularly online.
Did age play a role here, like it did with familiarity?
Interestingly, not really within each party. Younger and older Democrats largely agreed with each other, and younger and older Republicans largely agreed with each other. The partisan divide was the main driver.
Huh. So it's really about the political identity more than age when it comes to judging the action itself?
It seems so. Education levels made a slight difference within each party, for example. More educated Democrats were slightly more likely to see it as accountability, but the partisan gap remained the overwhelmingly dominant factor.
It really underscores just how ingrained these ideological viewpoints are when it comes to assessing online behavior.
Definitely. And to truly understand this divergence, the Pew study dug deeper into why people hold these views. They actually identified 5 key areas of disagreement in the reasons people gave.
5 areas. Okay, let's unpack those. These aren't just surface disagreements, right? They come from deeper beliefs.
Exactly. They stem from deeply held beliefs about society, justice, and, the very nature of online interaction.
Okay, what's the first major area of disagreement?
The first and most common one, cited by about a quarter of all adults, revolves around whether people who call others out are rushing to judge or if they're genuinely trying to be helpful.
Okay, judging versus helping.
Right. So on the accountability side, people argued that calling out is about improving society, maybe helping educate others to learn from mistakes, pushing us toward a better, more equitable future.
Makes sense.
But on the punishment side, respondents frequently mentioned, rashness, judgmental behavior, people overreacting without knowing the full context or the person's intention.
Like jumping to conclusions.
Exactly. They emphasize how people lash out impulsively, often based on a very subjective interpretation of what counts as offensive. So it's this fundamental difference in assessing the intent and the outcome of these digital call-outs.
Okay, that's the first one. What's the second area?
The second area, which accounted for about 14% of responses, centers on the actual productivity of the behavior. Does it achieve anything useful?
Okay. Does it work?
Pretty much. Those who view calling out as punishment often express this kind of profound cynicism. They feel it solves nothing concrete, or maybe it just makes things worse by escalating conflict.
Probably just stirs things up.
Some also believe that social media platforms themselves are just inherently problematic or toxic, totally unsuitable for productive conversations. So calling out there does more harm than good.
Okay, that's the cynical view. What about the other side?
The accountability advocates see it as vital, even necessary. It's a way to hold people responsible for what they post and to make sure individuals actually consider the consequences of their words in the public sphere. They see it as a deterrent, a corrective force.
Okay, productivity, what's the third area?
Then there's that classic enduring tension between free speech and the desire to create a comfortable online environment. About 10% of respondents focused keenly on this.
The free speech debate, always central.
Always. Those on the punishment side often hold this really strong, almost absolute belief in free speech on social media, the idea that these platforms should just be wide open forums for pretty much any expression.
Let everything fly.
Kind of. Conversely, those on the accountability side emphasize that online words do have weight. They have real-world impact. For them, it's about advocating for thoughtfulness before posting offensive content, or content that makes others feel unsafe or unwelcome.
So it's a conflict over whose comfort or whose freedom takes precedence online.
Precisely. And Pew Research has actually tracked how that specific tension has become increasingly partisan over the years. It's not a new debate, but it's getting sharper.
Okay, free speech versus comfort. What's number 4?
The fourth area, explored by about 8 and 9% of respondents, concerns the perceived agendas behind calling out. What's the motivation?
Oh, why are people really doing it?
Exactly. From the accountability perspective, calling out is seen as this necessary act to expose and combat pervasive social ills, things like misinformation, racism, ignorance, hate. It's about forcing individuals to confront their biases or explain themselves publicly.
Okay, a push for justice.
But from the punishment perspective, it's often seen as a tool just for canceling disagreement, for coercing or forcing certain views onto others. Or even, some felt, for marginalizing specific voices. A few respondents even explicitly mentioned concerns about silencing white voices and history. Others just viewed it as disingenuous behavior, maybe performed merely to look good or score social points online, like virtue signaling.
That really highlights the deep mistrust, doesn't it? What one person sees as a genuine cry for justice, another sees as a cynical power play or just performance.
It absolutely does. The perceived motivation completely alters how the action is viewed.
Okay, and the fifth area?
The fifth area, a smaller group, about 4 or 5% of responses, asked a very fundamental question. Should people even speak up if they're offended?
Oh, interesting. Just ignore it.
That's one view. On the punishment side, some believe that offensive posts should simply be ignored. Or maybe that individuals should just take personal responsibility and remove themselves. Block the account, scroll past.
Take the high road, maybe.
Or just disengage. But on the accountability side, there's this strong, almost moral imperative that it's absolutely necessary to speak up. Because in their view, saying nothing means nothing changes. Silence allows problematic behavior to just persist unchecked.
So speak up versus shut up, basically.
In a nutshell, it really forces us to confront how we bridge these enormous gaps in understanding when the very motivations, the perceived outcomes, even the basic necessity of calling out behavior are so fundamentally different.
Yeah, how do we bridge that?
Well, it's incredibly difficult. The Pew study did note a crucial point here, that some Americans do see shades of gray. They acknowledge that, the effectiveness of calling out varies case by case.
Right, not every situation is the same.
Exactly, and the responses from those called out can range from genuine apologies and learning all the way to anger and just doubling down. But that nuance
Gets lost.
It frequently gets lost in the broader, more polarized public discourse, which unfortunately just further entrenches the existing divisions.
It's so easy to get lost in these, abstract debates about definitions and intentions and the philosophy of free speech. But what actually happens to the individuals who find themselves targeted by cancel culture? Our sources reveal a profound and often devastating human cost.
Yeah, the personal impact can be immense. One source, Premier Science, actually defines cancel culture as an organized boycott, specifically aimed at an individual's career or reputation.
Organized boycott.
Right, for opinions perceived as dishonorable or unworthy. And these actions are often triggered by really sensitive issues, racism, sexism, other forms of perceived bigotry.
It happens fast, doesn't it?
Extremely fast. The Premier Science source emphasizes this rapid, almost mob-like nature. It talks about the emergence of online mob groups akin to hysteria, which can lead to these quick and unpredictable consequences for the person targeted.
Just like that, life changes.
It can. The article highlights how a seemingly innocent-looking tweet or comment can just unexpectedly spark something huge, leading to significant personal and professional fallout.
And the psychological effects.
They're significant. Commonly identified effects include severe anxiety, a really profound sense of social isolation, and often a tendency towards self-censorship in the future. People become afraid to speak.
It's not just about public backlash, then. It's a deeply personal, unsettling experience.
Absolutely.
We've seen this play out with famous people, obviously. Maybe the most prominent example recently is J.K. Rowling.
Right, the Harry Potter author.
Yeah. Globally beloved author finds herself at the center of this huge storm of criticism for her remarks on transgender rights, specifically endorsing views some call TERFism.
Views linking gender solely to biological sex.
Exactly. And this led to calls for boycotts, intense backlash online and off. And she herself has openly reported experiencing a great deal of anxiety. She's talked publicly about the psychological effects of being so widely criticized and this constant fear of more cancellations.
J.K. Rowling's experience, as documented in our sources, it really powerfully underscores that even individuals with immense platforms, huge resources, global recognition, they're not immune.
No.
They're not immune to the severe emotional and psychological toll of intense public criticism and that pervasive fear of ongoing backlash. Her stated concerns weren't just about the immediate criticism, but this continuous, lingering anxiety about future repercussions.
That must be exhausting.
It highlights this widespread feeling of vulnerability among many public figures now. They're grappling with how to balance their freedom of expression against this very real fear of dire repercussions for any perceived misstep in the digital age. It definitely raises questions about a potential chilling effect on open discourse.
But it's so crucial to remember, this isn't just about celebrities or public figures, right?
Not at all. That's why the qualitative study is so important.
Exactly. Our deep dive includes this powerful study from the Rupkatha journal, which used really in-depth one-on-one interviews to understand the diverse lived experiences of victims of cancel culture in the Philippines.
Getting those ground-level stories.
Yeah, these aren't just headlines. They are raw, personal stories of profound human impact. Take victim #1, for instance. She became the target of just vicious online rumors, falsely accused of drug addiction, having an affair.
And it targeted her family, too, didn't it?
Tragically, yes, especially her daughter. Thousands of online supporters on both sides apparently just made snap decisions. And these insidious vlogs fuel the narrative with completely made-up stories, just amplifying the misinformation and the harm.
And the real-world impact on her.
It was absolutely devastating. She described the terror of being publicly called out in a mall in front of a crowd of shoppers, people yelling, "Drug addict, homewrecker at her."
Oh, my God.
It led to this intense, debilitating fear. She was terrified to even leave her home. Severe self-confidence issues, clinical depression diagnosis, and just tragically even suicidal thoughts. She talked about staring aimlessly at a wall for hours, just overwhelmed by it all.
That's horrific. Did she get support?
Her family's unwavering support was crucial, she said, in her journey back. And she did take a drug test later to disprove the claims, but she still experiences flashbacks. Yeah. Thankfully, she says she's in a much better mindset now, but it just shows the severe mental health consequences.
Absolutely devastating.
And then there's victim #2. His ordeal started in April 2021. He was falsely accused of sexual assault on TikTok.
As part of that exposing your rapist trend.
Yeah, swept up in that. His name, Facebook screenshots, rapidly shared hundreds of thousands of times. It landed on countless TikTok For You pages. He was just instantly flooded with this torrent of threatening, profane comments, private messages.
From people who didn't even know him.
Exactly. Primarily Gen Z users, apparently, who had no personal knowledge of them or the alleged events. He became one of the most searched names on Facebook that day.
How did he react?
He expressed his profound reluctance to use social media or even leave his home. He had a genuine fear of physical harm based on the threats.
Understandable.
Fortunately, his family and friends believed him immediately. And critically, the false accusation video was taken down pretty quickly, and the user's account got disabled.
Okay, so there was a swift resolution in his case.
Relatively swift, yes, which helped his life return to some semblance of normality. His innocence was proven, the issue resolved, but he remained shaken by it all. He uses social media now with more caution, made his profiles private, doesn't accept unknown
The
friends.
trust is gone.
Yeah. And what particularly annoyed him, he said, was just the sheer number of people who piled on, criticizing him without making any attempt to verify the information. Just highlights the speed and recklessness, doesn't it?
It really does. The lack of due diligence online.
And victim #3 faced a different kind of cancellation, but equally impactful for him. He was a content creator who faced intense criticism for impersonating a K-pop superstar.
Ah, so not a moral accusation, but performance-based.
Exactly. The backlash wasn't about a moral failing, but targeted his movement, his attire, his voice, even his physical appearance. Fans deemed it not authentic or good enough.
K-pop fans can be notoriously intense.
Apparently so. He faced this intense outpouring of negativity memes, harsh insults. It significantly reduced his self-confidence.
How did it affect him personally?
He candidly admitted considering a facial procedure because he became so self-conscious about his appearance, directly stemming from that criticism. It shows the deep psychological toll these kinds of attacks can take, even if they aren't about, serious wrongdoing.
That's a powerful indicator of the pressure.
But what's fascinating here, and also quite inspiring, is his resilience.
Yeah, how did he cope?
He consciously chose to use the criticism as motivation. He turned to his faith, prioritized his family, and despite the ongoing harassment he still receives, he apparently managed to follow his dreams.
That's remarkable resilience. But the underlying point remains.
Yeah, the consistency of the psychological distress across these really varied cases. The anxiety, the fear, the social withdrawal, the impact on self-confidence, it's striking.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it overwhelmingly suggests that regardless of whether cancellation is perceived as justified or not, whether it's a false accusation or criticism of a performance, the process itself can be profoundly damaging to the individual's mental and emotional well-being.
It is genuinely inspiring, though, to see how some individuals navigate through such intense public scrutiny and find ways to cope and maybe even grow. Did the study identify common coping strategies?
It did. Several shared coping mechanisms emerged from the interviews.
Like what?
First, they actively chose to use the experience as a lesson, for personal growth, self-improvement, turning adversity into a catalyst for change.
Okay, finding meaning in it.
Second, they found solace in actively avoiding dwelling on the traumatic events. They focused on their daily activities, family, work, study, diverting their attention towards constructive pursuits.
Keeping busy, basically.
Third, they turned to faith and actively sought support from their immediate social circles, finding strength in their community.
Leaning on others.
And in one case, victim #1, she wisely sought professional mental health advice, recognizing the need for expert guidance to get through such an ordeal.
Which is so important.
Absolutely. These coping mechanisms are crucial takeaways for anyone facing similar situations, but it also raises that important, broader question.
Right. While individual resilience is vital, what's the responsibility of the platforms, of the wider public?
Exactly. What responsibility do social platforms and the public bear in maybe creating an environment where such extreme psychological distress is less common, or where individuals are better protected?
Yeah.
The study ultimately concludes that while cancel culture can be effective in raising awareness, potentially promoting social justice by addressing issues like racism or sexism, it also undeniably elevates bullying and can severely limit free expression.
And it undermines self-confidence.
Critically undermines it, especially when people are so quick to judge without making any real attempt to comprehend both sides of a situation.
Okay, so our sources clearly show that cancel culture isn't just about individual experiences or, those sensational headlines. It really touches upon fundamental questions about public discourse, the nature of it, and the very fabric of our societal norms.
Absolutely. It forces us to confront some big ethical questions.
And back in July 2020, there was this highly influential open letter published in Harper's Magazine, signed by 150 high-profile individuals, people like J.K. Rowling, Margaret Atwood, even Noam Chomsky. It really ignited a furious debate.
That letter made huge waves.
What was their central claim?
Their central claim was stark. They argued that open debate and toleration of differences were fundamentally under attack.
Under attack.
Yeah. They observed what they described as an intolerance of opposing views, a vogue for public shaming and ostracism, and the tendency to dissolve complex policy issues in a blinding moral certainty.
Strong words. Did they give examples?
They did. The letter didn't shy away from citing various examples to support their claim. Editors being fired for publishing controversial pieces.
Like James Bennett at the New York Times.
Exactly, for the Senator Tom Cotton op-ed. Also, books being withdrawn from publication, journalists barred from speaking engagements, professors investigated for their opinions, even researchers fired. Though, interestingly, while the case of Roland Fryer, the Harvard economist, was mentioned in the letter, discussions in the online political forum we looked at highlight the complexity there. They noted his suspension was officially tied to sexual misconduct allegations, not solely his research. And he did eventually return to teaching.
So the narrative isn't always as simple as presented.
Precisely. It's a crucial nuance. It indicates that while the Harper's letter definitely raised legitimate concerns about stifling dissent, some of its examples might have these underlying complexities not immediately apparent.
Still, that letter, coming from such a broad array of prominent voices, really suggested that something crucial in our public discourse might be eroding. It immediately raised that huge question. Where is the line between necessary pushback against harmful ideas and stifling legitimate, even uncomfortable, debate?
It's the core tension. Yet, as our sources also forcefully point out, a powerful counterargument quickly emerged and gained significant traction.
Which is?
Freedom of speech is not freedom from consequences.
Right. We hear that a lot.
It's a critical distinction, really lies at the heart of the debate. The argument isn't usually about legal prohibition of speech by the government, though that can happen. It's more about whether social censure, imposing consequences for certain speech, is not only permissible, but often necessary for a healthy society.
So, society policing itself, in a way.
You could frame it like that. Almost everyone would agree that some speech is just unequivocally beyond the pale, right? Like blatant racial slurs, incitement to violence, that requires calling out, requires harm minimization.
Sure.
The real debate, then, isn't about whether social norms should limit public discourse they always have throughout history. It's about the broadening scope of views that now seem to attract these punitive social responses, to the point where, as one source notes, virtually all utterances offend someone.
Yeah, it feels like the boundaries are constantly shifting.
Exactly. Which begs that important question. Who gets to define beyond the pale in this rapidly evolving digital landscape? And how do those definitions evolve, especially when they become so politicized?
And one of the ethical experts we looked at, Dr. Hugh Breakey from Griffith University, he highlights this particularly insidious concern he calls meta-argument allegations.
Meta-argument allegations. Okay, what are those?
These are claims that a speaker's words are wrongfully offensive or harmful, regardless of the actual validity or soundness of their argument.
So attacking the way something is said or its perceived effect, rather than the substance of the idea itself.
Precisely. It's a really insightful point about how we talk about disagreements, often completely bypassing the substance.
You've hit on something crucial there. Dr. Breakey argues these allegations have several deeply negative consequences for productive discourse.
Like what?
Firstly, he contends they just derail debate entirely.
Derail it? How?
Instead of engaging with the actual content of an argument, these allegations assume this immediate urgency. They transform the original point into a serious moral issue about the speaker's character or intent.
Right. It becomes about the person, not the idea.
Exactly. Think about how often you see this online. Someone isn't just disagreeing with an idea. They're accusing the person of bad intent, of being a bad person, simply for expressing it. That's what Dr. Breakey argues is derailing so many conversations.
That totally shifts the focus. What else?
Secondly, he points out that these claims of wrongfulness or harmfulness are often themselves highly debatable.
Okay.
Remember John Stuart Mill. The usefulness of an opinion is itself a matter of opinion. What one person considers deeply offensive or harmful, another might see as a legitimate, if uncomfortable, viewpoint, maybe even a necessary truth.
Different perspectives weigh harms differently.
Incredibly differently. And who's responsible for any negative knock-on effects? Is it the original speaker? Is it those who react? That itself can be debated. It's a really complex ethical landscape with no easy answers.
Okay. And the third consequence.
And thirdly, and this is something we see constantly online, these allegations create heat. They escalate things.
Yeah, they definitely make things more emotional.
Few people respond constructively when they feel they're being accused of moral wrongdoing, right? They tend to retaliate, escalating the conflict, and quickly treating their opponents as enemies rather than, fellow participants in a discussion.
It shuts down conversation.
Completely. This hostile environment actively prevents constructive engagement and mutual understanding. Instead of calmly considering a contentious claim on its merits, the discourse just evolves into angry allegations flying back and forth, hardening positions rather than softening them.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it really powerfully explains how debates can become so profoundly polarized and unproductive online. When the focus shifts from, is this argument sound, is this idea valid, to, is this speaker morally wrong or harmful, it almost inevitably fosters that political tribalism, reinforces confirmation bias, leads to groupthink, makes genuine understanding just incredibly difficult.
It's a critical ethical cost we're paying in our public discourse right now. And Dr. Brakey goes on to detail further ethical issues inherent in many cancellations.
Oh, it is.
He points out that even if we agree certain harmful speech deserves consequences, the punishment must ethically fit the perceived crime. Proportionality matters.
Right.
While maybe withdrawing support for a public figure or a product might be justified in some cases, harsher actions like doxing, revealing private information,
Which is dangerous.
extremely dangerous, relentless hounding, social ostracism, demanding someone lose their job, these can be inappropriate and even wrongfully harmful themselves. There's a crucial difference between social disapproval and actively trying to destroy someone's life or livelihood without any due process.
It certainly feels like there's a very fine line, doesn't it, between holding people accountable and just becoming a mob ourselves. How do we ensure the cure isn't worse than the disease, especially when consequences can feel so disproportionate?
That's a really important question to grapple with. If the true goal is to improve society or genuinely address harm, are these often unregulated methods always the most effective? Or do they sometimes inadvertently entrench division and prevent genuine learning or positive change?
Yeah.
Furthermore, this climate of constant outrage, the constant threat of these meta-argument challenges, can actually prevent people from even considering opposing viewpoints.
How so?
Well, the ease of just leveling accusations, saying something is offensive or dog whistling or harmful, it can remove the need for the hard work of trying to understand and then to interrogate and perhaps refute our opponent's argument.
So it's easier to label than to engage.
Much easier. And perversely, this can lead to what he calls a persuasive boomerang effect. Individuals can become more entrenched, more attached to the very views others are trying to eliminate because they feel attacked rather than engaged.
Huh. That's counterintuitive, but makes sense. You also mentioned rule of law concerns.
Yes, significant concerns about the rule of law. He emphasized the critical need for clear norms, impartial processes, and procedural safeguards when applying consequences to online behavior. Without these, he argues, we risk descending into mob rule, arbitrary power, and bullying, where power is just wielded without any accountability for those doing the canceling.
It sounds like a call for some kind of structure or agreed-upon rules, which seems hard to achieve online.
Incredibly difficult. Now, a provocative idea presented in those Reddit discussions we looked at is that much of the debate around cancel culture and free speech might sometimes function as red herrings.
Red herrings distraction.
Exactly, effectively distracting us from deeper, more fundamental societal issues. One user, referencing the writer P.E. Moskowitz, suggested that our intense focus on individual speech controversies might be preventing us from confronting larger systemic realities.
Like what kind of realities?
Things like wealth inequality, precarious jobs, healthcare access, fundamental vulnerabilities in our electoral systems, big picture stuff.
So the argument is we're fiddling while Rome burns, essentially. Getting caught up in online dramas.
That's the provocative idea. It encourages us to step back and question the narratives we're presented with. Is all the energy and attention spent on these passionate online debates truly addressing the root causes of societal discontent? Or is it maybe just a symptom of a deeper, unaddressed malaise in our society?
That's a powerful point. Definitely challenges our focus. And the Reddit forum also brought up that widely discussed idea that cancel culture is, at its core, simply consequence culture.
Right back to that idea, the fundamental reality that actions, especially in a public sphere, have social repercussions. And that's not new.
Not new at all. Which brings us back to that crucial distinction between freedom of speech, protection from government censorship, largely, and freedom of platform, which does not guarantee you an audience or a stage or a positive reception from private entities.
Exactly. Private companies, including social media platforms, absolutely have the right to deny access or remove content based on their own terms of service. That's not typically a First Amendment issue in the U.S., for example.
So applying consequences isn't necessarily infringing on free speech in the legal sense.
Often not. And what's fascinating here is how the perceived success or failure of a cancellation can itself become a central part of the ongoing public debate.
How do you mean?
Well, some users on Reddit pointed out, for example, that despite widespread calls to boycott her, J.K. Rowling is still a billionaire. Harry Potter franchises continue to thrive globally.
Right. She hasn't exactly been silenced or bankrupted.
Not by most measures. Similarly, Roland Fryer, the Harvard economist, despite his suspension, which, again, some users link to misconduct, not just research, he is still teaching at Harvard.
So it forces us to ask, what does being canceled truly entail? if the targets often remain powerful or professionally active.
Exactly. It forces us to refine our understanding. Is it about reputational damage, economic impact, loss of influence, or something else entirely? It's complex in our highly connected but also highly fragmented public sphere.
And it's important to acknowledge, as Reddit users did, that both sides of the political spectrum engage in boycotts or social shaming.
Oh, absolutely. The Bud Light absurdity, as one user called it, where the brand faced intense backlash from conservative consumers, vividly demonstrated that. It shows the universality of this consequence culture, regardless of political affiliation.
So it really begs the question, if Rowling is still a billionaire, if Fryer is still teaching, what does cancellation actually mean in practice? And what are its true limits? It adds this layer of complexity beyond the simple headlines.
It really does.
Ultimately, it feels like a lot of this boils down to how we as individuals consume, process, and react to information in this incredibly noisy digital age.
You've hit on something absolutely vital there. Many participants in the Reddit discussion emphasize the paramount importance of media literacy and critical thinking as potential solutions.
Solutions to navigate this landscape better.
Exactly. In an age of information overload, rampant misinformation, and all our pervasive cognitive biases, cultivating robust media literacy isn't just about understanding the news anymore. It's about discerning the intentions and potential impacts of online interactions themselves.
So thinking critically about tweets as much as news articles.
In a way, yes, and it involves actively seeking out diverse viewpoints, even when they're uncomfortable or challenge our existing beliefs, breaking out of our bubbles.
What kind of specific suggestions came up?
Things like teaching rhetoric and bias recognition in schools, starting from an early age, encouraging individuals to actively investigate sources beyond their algorithmic bubbles, which tend to just reinforce what we already think.
Get outside the echo chamber.
Precisely. The challenge of AI's current inability to recognize nuance and sarcasm was also raised. There's a concern that this could inadvertently lead to a kind of robotic thinking online where people self-censor or oversimplify their expressions just to avoid misinterpretation or algorithmic flagging.
That's a scary thought.
It is.
Yeah.
But it highlights that this whole conversation about how we communicate, how we hold each other accountable, the ethical lines we draw, it's clearly not going away anytime soon.
Wow. This deep dive has truly revealed that cancel culture is just so much more than a fleeting buzzword or some simple online trend.
It really is deeply embedded in current societal dynamics.
It's a profound reflection of our deepest values, isn't it? Our increasingly sharp divides and these ever-evolving complex rules of engagement in a digital world that's just accelerating all the time. We've seen how deeply divided people are, even on its basic definition. Is it fundamentally about necessary accountability, or is it an unjust form of punishment?
That core disagreement shapes everything else.
We explored the surprisingly consistent patterns in public awareness, but also those incredibly sharp partisan divisions in how people perceive calling out behavior. We really dissected the fundamental disagreements underlying those views, everything from the perceived helpfulness of public shaming to those deeply held concerns about the limits of free speech.
And we really tried to highlight the profound, undeniable human cost, didn't we? Moving beyond the abstract to the real psychological harm experienced by individuals.
Absolutely. We discussed the anxiety, the social isolation, the self-censorship that can result, powerfully illustrated by high-profile experiences like J.K. Rowling's, but even more vividly by those intimate, sometimes heartbreaking stories from the qualitative study in the Philippines.
Those personal accounts are so crucial for understanding the impact. We also delved into those vital ethical considerations around free speech, the nuances of consequences, the very nature of public discourse itself. From the widely debated Harper's letter to those insightful critiques of meta-argument allegations.
If we try to connect all of this to the bigger picture, it feels like the ongoing, fervent debate around cancel culture really compels each of us to critically examine, well, not just what we say, but how we react.
Yes, our reactions are key.
How we collectively define justice in this interconnected world, and whether our collective actions are truly fostering a more inclusive and understanding public sphere, or if maybe they're inadvertently deepening the divisions that already exist.
It's a dialogue that impacts everyone who participates in the digital world, which is most of us now.
It really is. Thank you for joining us on this incredibly important exploration.
And perhaps a final thought to leave everyone with. Given that every society throughout history has had some form of social shaming, public disapproval, consequences for actions, what is truly new and maybe unprecedented about cancel culture in our specific digital age?
What makes this moment different?
Right. And flowing from that, what unique responsibilities do we as active participants in this online world bear in shaping its future direction? How do we ensure that calls for accountability don't inadvertently stifle crucial, even uncomfortable dialogue? It's a question that demands continuous reflection and engagement from all of us, I think.